At 9:17 in the morning on a hot day in early 1942, a group of B-17 flying Fortress planes opened their bomb doors over the Solomon Sea. They were flying at 20,000 feet high, the perfect height, according to the Army Air Force book. Below them, Japanese destroyer ships cut through the blue water like sharp knives. The American bomb crews looked through their special bomb sights. These devices were so secret and complicated that people said they could drop a pickle into a barrel from 4 miles up. The math was done. The wind was measured. The release levers were pulled. Dozens of 500-pound bombs fell down through the clouds. The crews waited 40 long seconds for the bombs to hit, expecting to see the enemy ships explode in flames. They missed everything. The ocean exploded in white water 200 yards away from the nearest Japanese ship. The destroyers didn't even change direction. Their captains simply watched the bombs fall, ordered the ship to turn left or right, and let the American bombs splash harmlessly into the empty ocean. It was embarrassing. It was supposed to be impossible, but it was happening every single day. The Army had spent millions of dollars telling everyone that dropping bombs from high up was the future of war. But here in the messy Southwest Pacific, the future looked useless. The pilots flew back to their bases in New Guinea, tired, angry, and with nothing to show. Meanwhile, the Japanese Tokyo Express kept delivering thousands of soldiers and tons of supplies to the jungle without a scratch. This failure was the nightmare waiting for General George Kenney when he arrived to take command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was not a man who cared about rule books or shiny buttons. He was a short, tough, rough-talking pilot who looked more like a mechanic than a general. He walked with confidence and talked like he was ready to argue. When he landed in Australia, he found an air force that was sad and broken. The repair crews were using scrap metal to keep planes flying. The pilots were flying dangerous missions with plans that didn't work, and the Japanese Navy was easily beating them. Kenney looked at the reports about the high-altitude bombing and threw them in the trash. He knew that trying to hit a destroyer moving at 30 knots from 20,000 feet was like standing on top of a skyscraper and trying to drop a marble into a coffee cup being pulled by a running cat. The problem was the science of the attack. A bomb dropped from high up takes almost a minute to reach the ocean. In that minute, a destroyer captain can look up, see the bomb doors open, and move his ship half a mile in any direction. The Japanese knew this. They made fun of the American bombers. They didn't even bother to scatter. They just moved out of the way and let the ocean swallow the American money. Kenney realized that if he wanted to stop the bleeding in the Pacific, he had to stop those ships. And if he wanted to stop those ships, he had to get lower. He needed to get down into the spray and salt, right in the face of the enemy. But he didn't just want to shoot them with machine guns. Machine guns were for shooting down weak airplanes. They would bounce off the steel body of a destroyer like gravel thrown at a tank. Kenney needed artillery. He needed a weapon that could punch through a boiler room or rip the bridge off a warship. He started looking around his hangars for a solution. He saw the B-25 Mitchell bomber. It was a strong twin-engine medium bomber, reliable and tough, but it was designed to drop bombs, not fight like a battleship. Then he looked at the ground equipment. He saw the standard Army 75mm field gun. It was a monster of a weapon, a descendant of the famous French 75 from World War I. It fired a 15-pound shell that could smash through concrete bunkers and light tanks. It was heavy violet and designed to be bolted to the ground or mounted inside a 30-ton Sherman tank. It was absolutely not designed to be bolted inside the nose of an airplane. The idea was crazy. Putting a 75mm cannon into a B-25 was like trying to mount a howitzer on a surfboard. The weight alone was a nightmare. The cannon weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. The ammunition weighed hundreds more. And then there was the kickback. When a 75mm cannon fires, it creates a kickback force that feels like a car crash. On the ground, the gun digs its feet into the dirt to absorb the shock. In a tank, the 30 tons of steel absorb the kick. In an aircraft, there is nothing to absorb the shock except the aluminum frame and the rivets holding the wings together. The engineers at American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, looked at Kenney's request and thought he had lost his mind. They pulled out their calculators and ran the math. The numbers came back bad. They told Kenney that the kickback from the cannon would tear the nose off the aircraft. They said the shock wave would shatter the glass in the cockpit and possibly knock the pilot out cold. They said that even if the plane held together, the sudden stop from firing the gun would cause the aircraft to stall in midair and drop out of the sky like a stone. They wrote long, detailed reports explaining exactly why this was impossible. They used words like structural fatigue, airframe stress limits, and catastrophic failure. They basically told the general that he was asking them to build a death trap that would kill his own pilots faster than the Japanese could. They suggested he stick to bombs and machine guns, the things the plane was actually designed to carry. Kenney didn't care about their calculators. He cared about the Japanese destroyers that were currently unloading troops on Guadalcanal and New Guinea, while his bombers missed them from way up high. He looked at the engineers and gave them a simple order: throw the manual away. He wasn't asking for permission. He was telling them what was going to happen. He wanted the glass nose of the B-25 removed. He wanted a solid metal nose installed to hold the massive cannon. He wanted the cockpit rearranged so a loader could stand next to the pilot and push artillery shells into the gun by hand while the plane was bouncing through rough air at 200 miles per hour. The fight between the experts in California and the warriors in the Pacific reached a boiling point. The engineers saw the aircraft as a delicate machine, a careful balance of lift and drag and thrust. Kenney saw the aircraft as a tool to kill the enemy, and if he had to break the tool to get the job done, he would break it. He argued that the B-25 was stronger than the designers thought. He told them that in the jungle, his mechanics were patching holes with soup cans and wire, and the planes were still flying. He was betting the lives of his men on the idea that a wild, desperate innovation could beat the carefully calculated perfection of the factory blueprints. The experts finally gave in, but not because they agreed. They gave in because Kenney was a general with the full weight of the war effort behind him. They agreed to build a test model, but the doubt was thick enough to cut with a knife. They called it the B-25G model. To the engineers, it was a monster, a Frankenstein creation that broke every rule of airplane design. To the pilots, it was a terrifying rumor. They heard whispers about a plane that carried a tank gun. They joked that the plane would fly backward when they pulled the trigger. They called it the flying artillery. But beneath the jokes, there was real fear. They were being asked to fly straight at a destroyer, a ship armed with dozens of anti-aircraft guns, and fire a single shot from a weapon that might rip their own wings off. Kenney sent the order to modify the first batch of planes. He wasn't waiting for perfect test results. He needed the weapons now. The factory floor at American Aviation became a scene of confused urgency. Beautiful streamlined glass noses were chopped off. Heavy steel cradles were bolted into the planes. The careful balance of the aircraft was completely destroyed. They had to add hundreds of pounds of lead weight to the tail just to keep the plane from tipping forward onto its nose when it was parked on the runway. It was ugly. It was heavy. It handled like a dump truck. And nobody, not even Kenney, knew for sure what would happen when the pilot pulled the trigger for the first time in combat. The stage was set for a disaster or a revolution. The change of the B-25 from a medium bomber into a flying gunship did not happen in a clean laboratory with scientists in white coats gently turning screwdrivers. It happened in hot, sweaty hangars in Townsville and Port Moresby where mechanics stripped the aircraft down like a chop shop operation. The beautiful glass nose, which gave the bombardier a great view of the target, was rudely sawed off. In its place, the crews installed a blunt, ugly snout made of sheet metal. It looked like the plane had been punched in the face, and the swelling hadn't gone down. Inside this metal snout sat the M4 cannon, a weapon so large that the pilot could practically reach out and touch it. The installation was a nightmare of pipes and steel. The kickback system alone, a complicated system of hydraulic fluid and heavy springs, took up half the front compartment. This system was the only thing standing between the pilot and a broken neck. It was designed to absorb the 21-inch kick of the barrel, soaking up the violence of the explosion, so the plane didn't have to. To fit this monster, the interior of the plane had to be gutted. The navigator station, usually a place of maps and quiet thinking, was deleted entirely. The bombardier, the man who was supposed to be the star of the show with his special bomb sight, was fired. In their place stood a new crew member with the most terrifying job description in the Army Air Force, the cannoneer. This wasn't a job for a small man. The cannoneer had to stand in a cramped, shaking tunnel of aluminum right next to the pilot's knees and wrestle with 15-pound artillery shells. There was no automatic loader. There was no robotic arm. There was just a man, a rack of high-explosive shells, and a cannon that smelled of hot grease and burnt powder. He had to physically push the shell into the gun, slam the block closed, tap the pilot on the shoulder to signal ready, and then brace himself against the wall while the gun fired inches from his head. The engineers back in California had warned that the center of gravity would be terrible. They were partly right. When the mechanics finished the first modification, the plane was so nose-heavy that the tail will lift it off the ground. It looked like a sniffing dog. To fix it, they didn't use fancy aerodynamic balances. They just bolted lead bars into the tail section until the plane sat flat again. It was a crude backyard solution that added even more weight to an already slow aircraft. When the test pilots climbed in for the first taxi runs, they reported that the plane handled like a dump truck with wings. It was heavy, slow to respond, and groaned under the weight of the artillery piece. The sleek, quick bomber was gone. In its place was a flying tank that the crews nervously and lovingly nicknamed the Little Monster. General Kenney didn't care about how it handled. He cared about pulling the trigger. The first live fire test was the moment of truth that would either prove him right or end his career in a trial for reckless endangerment. The test plane rumbled down the runway, using almost every foot of pavement to heave itself into the humid air. It climbed slowly, struggling for height. The target was a small, empty coral reef off the coast. The pilot lined up the nose, fighting the sluggish controls. Inside the cockpit, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The cannoneer slammed the first shell home. "Gun ready," he shouted over the roar of the engines. The pilot put the reef in his simple sights, just a post, and ringed sight bolted to the dashboard, and squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The feeling was impossible to describe. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical event. The entire plane shook as if it had flown into a brick wall. The plane's forward movement seemed to pause for a split second, stopped by the simple physics of Newton's third law. Inside the cockpit, a cloud of bitter white gun smoke filled the air, temporarily blinding the crew. The noise was a deafening thump that rattled the pilot's teeth. But then the smoke cleared. The wings were still attached. The rivets held. The glass didn't shatter. And down on the reef, a massive plume of water and crushed coral exploded exactly where the nose had been pointing. The kickback hadn't stalled the engines. The structure hadn't failed. The California engineers had been wrong. You could put a field gun in a plane, as long as you were crazy enough to fly it. With the idea proven, the Green Dragons, the 405th Bomb Squadron, began the hard process of learning how to fight with this new weapon. It required completely rewriting the pilot's manual. A bomber pilot is trained to fly straight and level to be a stable platform for dropping bombs. A gunship pilot had to be a fighter. The 75mm cannon was fixed forward. It couldn't turn or pivot. To aim the gun, you had to aim the entire plane. This meant the pilot had to dive the massive bomber directly at the target, ignoring the anti-aircraft fire, and hold the nose steady until he was close enough to guarantee a hit. They called it bore sighting. It was a game of chicken played at 200 miles per hour. The effective range of the cannon was technically thousands of yards, but in the chaos of combat, the pilots found they had to get close, dangerously close. 1,000 yards, 800 yards, close enough to see the rivets on the enemy ship. The training was intense. Pilots practiced diving on old shipwrecks, learning the terrifying rhythm of the attack run. Dive, stabilize, fire, recover from the kickback, reload, fire again. The rate of fire was slow, maybe 3 or 4 rounds in a single pass if the cannoneer was fast and didn't pass out from the G-forces. This wasn't a machine gun that sprayed bullets. This was a sniper rifle. You had one shot, maybe 2, to hit a moving target while your own plane was bouncing through rough air. If you missed, you had to loop around and try again, exposing your belly to the enemy guns. The crews learned to work together like a football team. The pilot focused on flying. The co-pilot managed the engines and called out distances. The cannoneer became a rhythm machine. Load, close, clear, fire. Load, close, clear, fire. They practiced until their hands were raw and the cockpit floor was covered in heavy brass shell casings. The first victims of this new weapon were not the mighty destroyers, but the coastal barges and small boats that the Japanese used to carry supplies between the islands. These were small wooden or rusty steel boats, usually armed with a single machine gun. The B-25s found them creeping along the coastline at dawn. The fight was almost unfair. A standard bomb would often punch right through a wooden barge without exploding, leaving a neat hole but failing to sink it. The 75mm high-explosive shell was different. When the first round hit a supply barge near La, the result was total destruction. The shell smashed into the body and exploded inside the cargo hold. The barge didn't just sink. It vanished in a shower of splinters and burning fuel. The pilots returned to base with wide eyes. They hadn't just damaged the enemy. They had erased them. Word spread quickly through the squadrons. The death trap was actually a hammer. The doubt disappeared, replaced by hungry eagerness. Crews started painting names on their gunships, aggressive names like Ominous 7, Sunday Punch, and Dirty Dora. They mounted additional machine guns in the nose, surrounding the cannon with .450 caliber heavy machine guns. Now, when a pilot pulled the trigger, he wasn't just firing artillery. He was unleashing a storm of bullets that could shred the deck crews before the cannon delivered the knockout blow. They called it the Commerce Destroyer Setup. It was a weapon system designed for one purpose, to hunt ships. But hunting barges was target practice. The real test, the one General Kenney had built this monster for, was the Tokyo Express. The Japanese Navy was still running destroyers down the slot, confident and untouched. These weren't defenseless barges. A Japanese destroyer was a 300-foot spear of steel, bristling with 25mm automatic cannons and 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Its crew was disciplined, battle-hardened, and experts at shooting down aircraft. They had watched American bombers fail for months. They had no respect for the B-25. To them, a medium bomber at low altitude was just a large target, a slow-moving duck waiting to be shot from the sky. The buildup began in late 1942. The Japanese High Command, frustrated by the slow loss of their barges, decided to send a major convoy to reinforce their bases on New Guinea. They gathered a fleet of fast transports protected by the Amatsukes and her sister destroyers. These were the wolves of the ocean, ships that had fought the U.S. Navy to a standstill at Guadalcanal. They were fast, easy to turn, and heavily armed. They sailed south with the confidence of top predators, assuming their speed would protect them from submarines and their anti-aircraft guns would protect them from high-altitude bombers. They didn't know the rules of the game had changed. They didn't know that a squadron of B-25s was waiting on the runway, engines warming up, with artillery shells stacked in the racks. On the morning of the attack, the weather was patchy with low clouds hugging the water, perfect cover for a low-level ambush. Major Edens, leading the flight, checked his instruments. His plane, heavily loaded with fuel and ammunition, felt sluggish in his hands. He looked over at his co-pilot, then back at the cannoneer, who gave a nervous thumbs up. They were hunting giants today. The chatter on the radio was minimal. The pilots knew the stakes. If the engineers were right, the first hit from a destroyer's main gun would turn their aluminum planes into confetti. If Kenney was right, the 75mm cannon would crack the destroyers open like tin cans. As they broke through the cloud layer, the convoy appeared on the horizon, gray shapes cutting white wakes through the dark water. The destroyers spotted them immediately. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began to blossom in the sky long before the planes were in range. The Japanese captains ordered their ships to turn, presenting their sides to bring maximum firepower to bear. It was the standard defense, a wall of steel thrown into the sky. But the B-25s didn't climb. They didn't open bomb bay doors. They dropped. They pushed their control sticks forward and descended until they were skimming 50 feet above the waves, their propellers kicking up spray. They were flying straight into the teeth of the enemy fire, closing the distance at 300 feet per second. The experts had said this was suicide. The pilots were about to find out if it was actually murder. The distance between the B-25 and the Japanese destroyer Amatsuke's closed at a combined speed of nearly 400 miles per hour. From the bridge of the destroyer, the Japanese captain watched the American bomber through his binoculars with a mixture of confusion and professional disdain. He had seen this trick before. It looked like a standard torpedo run. American torpedo planes always came in low and slow, trying to drop their fish into the water so they could run straight and true. The counter tactic was basic naval doctrine: turn the ship into the attack. By pointing the sharp bow of the destroyer directly at the plane, he would present the smallest possible target, making the torpedo pass harmlessly down the side of the hull. He barked the order to the helmsman. The 300-foot warship leaned hard to starboard, carving a massive white arc in the ocean as it swung its nose around to face the intruder. But as the destroyer turned, the captain noticed something wrong. The American plane wasn't dropping a torpedo. It wasn't pulling up. It wasn't weaving to avoid the anti-aircraft fire. It was flying in a straight, terrifying line, nose down like a hawk diving on a field mouse. The B-25 wasn't trying to flank the ship. It was charging it head-on. This was madness. By flying directly at the bow, the American pilot was flying straight into the barrel of the destroyer's forward 5-inch gun and the dual 25mm automatic cannons mounted on the bridge wings. It was a game of chicken between a 20,000-pound aluminum airplane and a 2,000-ton steel warship. The Japanese gunners opened fire. Tracers lashed out from the ship like fiery whips, cracking the air around the cockpit. The sky became a wild web of black smoke puffs and screaming metal. Inside the cockpit of the lead B-25, the world shrank down to the size of the ring sight mounted on the dashboard. The pilot gripped the control stick with white knuckles, fighting the rough air and the instinct to flinch. Every tracer that zipped past the canopy was a reminder of how thin the aluminum skin really was. A single hit from the destroyer's main gun would vaporize the plane instantly. But the pilot couldn't dodge. The 75mm cannon was bolted to the floor. To aim the gun, he had to aim the plane. He had to hold the aircraft steady in the face of a wall of steel, ignoring the explosions, ignoring the fear, and trusting the math. He was the targeting computer. His hands, his eyes, and his nerve were the only guidance system the weapon had. At 1,200 yards, the pilot squeezed the trigger on the control column, not for the cannon, but for the machine guns. For 50-caliber heavy machine guns mounted in the nose erupted at the same time. The sound was a jackhammer roar that shook through the floorboards. Streams of armor-piercing, incendiary bullets poured out of the nose at a rate of 50 rounds per second. They walked across the water like a chainsaw, kicking up a line of white splashes that raced toward the destroyer. The impacts hit the ship's bow and swept backward toward the bridge. The bullets hammered against the steel plating, sparking and bouncing off. But they weren't meant to sink the ship. They were meant to blind it. The hail of bullets smashed the glass of the bridge windows and shredded the unprotected anti-aircraft crews on the deck. The Japanese gunners, who moments ago had been firing with disciplined precision, were forced to duck for cover behind their gun shields. The anti-aircraft fire weakened. That was the opening. The pilot held the dive. The destroyer filled the entire windshield, a gray mountain of steel growing larger by the millisecond. 800 yards. 700 yards. The cannoneer in the tunnel tapped the pilot's shoulder. The gun was hot. The chamber was closed. The shell was live. The pilot made a tiny adjustment on the control stick, lifting the nose just a fraction of a degree to aim for the waterline right beneath the forward turret. He stopped breathing. He squeezed the cannon trigger. The B-25 stopped in midair. That's what it felt like. The kickback of the 75mm cannon delivered a punch of force equal to hitting a brick wall. The plane shook violently from nose to tail. Dust and dirt from the floorboards floated up into the air. The smell of burning powder flooded the cockpit, sharp and bitter. For a split second, the pilot was blind, the view blocked by the massive cloud of white smoke that burst from the gun barrel. But the physics of the shell were already at work. The 15-pound high-explosive shell left the barrel at 2,000 feet per second. It crossed the 600 yards of open ocean in less than a second. It didn't skip off the water. It didn't bounce off the armor. It struck the steel hull of the destroyer just above the waterline with the force of a freight train. The impact was catastrophic. A destroyer's hull is designed to stop machine gun bullets and shrapnel, not artillery shells. The 75mm round punched through the half-inch steel plating as if it were wet cardboard. It didn't explode on the outside. The fuse was set with a split-second delay. The shell smashed through the outer skin, tore through a bulkhead, and exploded deep inside the ship's machinery spaces. The blast shredded steam pipes and electrical wires. It turned the interior of the forward compartment into a blender of shrapnel and high-pressure steam. On the bridge, the Japanese officers felt the ship lurch as if it had run aground. They didn't understand what had hit them. It felt like a torpedo, but there was no wake. It felt like a mine, but they were in deep water. They never imagined they had just been shelled by an airplane. The B-25 roared over the destroyer's masts so close the rear gunner could look down and see the panic on the deck. As the pilot pulled back on the stick to climb away, the cannoneer was already moving. This was the hardest part of the job. The aircraft was banking hard, pulling G-forces that made his body weigh twice its normal weight. He had to keep his balance on the shaking metal floor, reach into the rack, and pull out another 15-pound shell. He wrestled the heavy brass casing into the gun, his muscles straining against the G-force. He slammed the chamber, closed with a metallic clang that echoed through the plane. "Up!" he screamed into the intercom. The gun was ready again. The pilot brought the plane around in a tight, aggressive turn. He looked back at the target. The destroyer wasn't moving anymore. Smoke was pouring from a jagged hole in the bow. The ship was leaning slightly to port. The hit had damaged something critical. Maybe a boiler, maybe the steering gear. The Predator was wounded. The pilot lined up for a second pass. This time there was no surprise. The Japanese sailors were scrambling to get their guns back in action, but the fear had set in. They weren't shooting at a fragile bird anymore. They were shooting at a flying tank. On the second run, the pilot aimed for the stern. He wanted to knock out the propulsion. He repeated the deadly rhythm, the strafing run to suppress the deck, the hold, the trigger squeeze. The cannon barked again. The kickback shook the plane. The second shell struck the rear section of the destroyer, near the depth charge racks. The explosion was different this time, a secondary explosion. The shell had ignited something explosive. A massive fireball erupted from the rear of the ship, blowing debris high into the air. The shock wave rippled through the water, visible from the air as a dark ring expanding outward. The destroyer shuddered and began to slow. The white wake behind it, once a frothy trail of speed, faded to a swirling mess. The great ship was dead in the water. The rest of the squadron descended like vultures. They didn't need the cannons anymore. They switched to skip bombing. They came in low, releasing 500-pound bombs that skipped across the water surface like flat stones on a pond. The bomb slammed into the side of the crippled destroyer, exploding on contact with the hull. The Amatsukes groaned under the attack. The steel plates buckled. The ocean rushed in. The proud warship, a vessel that had terrorized the South Pacific for a year, began to settle into the water. It hadn't been sunk by a battleship. It hadn't been sunk by a submarine. It had been beaten to death by a group of modified bombers that the experts said would never fly. As the B-25s turned for home, the crews looked back at the burning wreck. The radio chatter was ecstatic. They were shouting, laughing, releasing the adrenaline that had built up during the terrifying approach. But beneath the celebration, there was a deep realization. The balance of the Pacific War had just shifted. For 2 years, the surface ship had been the king of the ocean, vulnerable only to other ships or lucky dive bombers. Now the equation was broken. A single airplane armed with a weapon pulled from a tank could hunt down and kill a warship. The Japanese Navy could no longer hide behind their anti-aircraft fire. They could no longer rely on speed. The ocean had become a very small, very dangerous place. Back in the cockpit, the pilot flexed his hands to get the blood flowing again. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. The floor was littered with hot brass casings that rolled around with every turn. The nose of the plane was covered in soot from the gun blasts. The aircraft handled even worse now, lighter by the weight of the ammunition, but still aerodynamically terrible. But the pilot didn't care about the drag, or the heavy nose, or the lack of a navigator. He patted the dashboard. The death trap had worked. The engineers in California could keep their calculators. Out here in the salt and the smoke, they had found the answer. They had turned the B-25 into the ultimate can opener. When Major Edens and his flight of battered B-25s touched down at Port Moresby, the aircraft didn't look like the same machines that had taken off hours earlier. The clean aluminum skins were stained black with soot from the gun blasts. The paint on the nose cones was blistered from the heat of the cannon fire. Inside the cockpits, the floorboards were littered with heavy brass shell casings that rolled back and forth with every bump on the runway, chiming like church bells. The crews climbed out of the hatches with shaky legs, their flight suits soaked through with sweat, their ears ringing from the force of the 75mm guns. They looked like men who had just gone 12 rounds in a boxing ring, but their eyes were alive with a wild electric energy. They hadn't just survived a suicide mission. They had rewritten the laws of physics. The debriefing room was usually a quiet place where pilots reported missed targets and heavy anti-aircraft fire. But today it was a scene of wild victory. The gun camera footage told the story better than any written report could. Grainy black and white film showed the impossible truth. The massive splash of the cannon shell hitting the water, the violent shudder of the impact on the destroyer's hull, and the explosion that ripped the ship apart. General Kenney looked at the photos of the burning Amatsukes and smiled. It was the smile of a man who had bet his entire reputation on a stupid idea and won. He ordered the photos to be developed immediately and sent back to the United States. He wanted them on the desk of every engineer at American Aviation who had told him the kickback would tear the wings off. The message was clear. The wings were fine, but the Japanese Navy was in big trouble. The success of the flying artillery changed the manufacturing priorities of the war overnight. The engineers in California, the ones with the calculators and the stress charts, stopped arguing and started building. The B-25G model went into full production, followed quickly by the even more heavily armed H model. The factory floors that had once been doubtful were now churning out these monsters as fast as they could weld the steel noses on. They stopped trying to make the plane aerodynamic and started trying to make it deadly. They added more armor plating around the cockpit to protect the pilots from the intense return fire they faced at low altitude. They upgraded the kickback systems. They turned the B-25 from a medium bomber into the top street fighter of the Pacific Theater. For the Japanese captains sailing the Bismarck Sea and the straits around New Guinea, the ocean had become a terrifying place. They had spent the early years of the war fearing dive bombers and submarines, threats they could see coming or move against. But this new weapon was different. It was a psychological terror. There was something deeply unnatural about being shelled by an airplane. It broke the established rules of warfare. Convoys that used to sail confidently in broad daylight began to hide in the shadows of the islands, moving only at night or in bad weather. The confidence of the Tokyo Express evaporated. The destroyers that had once laughed at high-altitude bombers now turned and ran the moment they saw a twin-engine silhouette on the horizon. The hunters had become the hunted. The peak of the cannon's career came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where the tactic of skip bombing combined with the suppressive fire of the gunships resulted in the total destruction of a Japanese reinforcement fleet. It was a massacre. The B-25s came in at deck level, their nose guns blazing, turning the troop transports into slaughterhouses before smashing them with bombs. The sea was covered in oil and debris for miles. It was the final proof that the era of the invincible surface ship was over. The B-25 had proven that air power, when applied with enough violence and cleverness, could strangle an island nation's supply lines completely. However, the reign of the 75mm cannon was intense but surprisingly short. As the war dragged on into 1944 and 1945, technology began to catch up with General Kenney's vision. The cannon was effective, but it was difficult to use. It required a pilot with nerves of steel and the aim of a sniper. It required a human loader to wrestle heavy shells in a moving aircraft. It was a brute force solution from a mechanical age. The replacement arrived in the form of the high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVAR. These were 5-inch rockets that could be mounted under the wings of almost any fighter or bomber. They didn't have the kickback of the cannon. They didn't need a loader. A pilot could fire a salvo of 8 rockets with the push of a button, delivering the same destructive power as a broadside from a destroyer. The rockets were easier, lighter, and more efficient. The massive M4 cannon began to look like a dinosaur. The later models of the B-25 replaced the single big gun with a solid nose packed with 8, sometimes 12, 50 caliber machine guns. It became a flying buzzsaw, capable of shredding a target with volume of fire rather than a single knockout punch. The pilots missed the raw power of the little monster, the feeling of the plane stopping in midair when they pulled the trigger. But they couldn't argue with the efficiency of the rockets. The cannon had done its job. It had bridged the gap between the failure of high-altitude bombing and the arrival of the rocket age. It had saved the campaign in New Guinea when nothing else could. By the time the war ended, the B-25 gunships were being scrapped or sold off. The massive cannons were unbolted and thrown into piles of surplus metal. General Kenney moved on to other commands, his reputation cemented as the man who revolutionized air warfare in the Pacific. The pilots went home to become accountants and car salesmen, rarely speaking about the days when they flew tank guns into the faces of destroyers. The flying artillery faded into a footnote of aviation history, a strange experiment that people assumed was just a desperate improvisation. But the idea didn't die. The concept of a heavy gunship, a plane that circles a target and rains down heavy fire, was buried in the archives, waiting for the next war to dig it up. 20 years later, in the jungles of Vietnam, the concept was reborn. The Air Force took an old cargo plane, the C-47, and mounted Gatling guns in the side doors. They called it Spooky. It was the direct spiritual descendant of Kenney's B-25. Then came the AC-130 Spectre, a massive transport plane armed with 40mm cannons and eventually a 105mm howitzer, the same size of field artillery that Kenney had dreamed of using. The AC-130 became the ultimate realization of the idea, a flying battleship that could circle a target and destroy it with precision artillery fire from the sky. Every time a Spectre gunship fires a shell today, it is echoing the thunder of those first, clumsy, terrifying shots fired by the B-25s over the Bismarck Sea. The engineers said it was impossible. They said the physics wouldn't work. They said the kickback would destroy the plane. But history is rarely written by the people who say it can't be done. It is written by the people who are too stubborn to listen. It is written by men like General Kenney, who looked at a manual and saw only a suggestion. It is written by men like Major Edens, who looked at a destroyer and decided to charge it head-on. They proved that sometimes the smartest solution is the one that looks the stupidest on paper. They proved that with enough courage and enough gunpowder, you can make a bomber do the job of a battleship. We rescue these stories to make sure that the Green Dragons and their rattled, smoke-filled cockpits don't disappear into silence. We tell them because they remind us that innovation isn't always about high-tech microchips or sleek aerodynamics. Sometimes innovation is just a big gun, a heavy hammer, and the will to use it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the insane engineering of World War II, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that real history matters. Check your subscription status. Make sure you're locked in so you don't miss the next episode, where we uncover another forgotten machine of war. And leave a comment below. Would you have been crazy enough to stand in that nose and load the shell? I'll see you in the next one.